Chris Waller. He's the trainer of Winx, among other champions. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Now, Chris, we know that you've been in this industry for decades now. This is your lifeline. What was your reaction when you first saw footage of the treatment of some of those horses?
Good morning, Felsia. Yeah, I was shocked. A lot of that vision I couldn't watch myself. It was sickening. To think that there were a few horses that were racehorses was bad enough, but for any horse, for that to happen to them, let alone an animal, like it just blew me away, as it has with my fellow colleagues and trainers and lovers of animals. We couldn't believe what we were seeing, and I think it's great that it's been exposed, but now's the time to make sure that the proper questions are answered, and it's the end of mistreatment of any animal.
Chris, where do you think the system broke down for these animals? Where did we go wrong?
Well, we've got very strict guidelines from our own racing authorities. In particular, it's really stepped up in the last few years, where we must document at length where a horse is going to when it leaves our stable, whether it be sold or whether it be retired. So once that horse leaves our stable, we've got to make sure there's a paper trail to show where it goes. It seems to be there could be a breakdown when those horses leave the racing industry and then they enter other parts of Australia where we're losing sight of what's happened to them. So fortunately it's a very minimal number, but that minimal number is not good enough. It's got to be every horse. And we need to step up procedures. The industry needs to be responsible, and it needs to be backed by the federal and state governments to make sure that these people are brought to trial and make sure that the fines and the terms fit the sentence.
You know, Chris, some people have said that the story is actually in the numbers themselves. We know that most horses are bred for racehorsing. They race only for about a few years or so, but they live till about 30, and that leaves a large number of horses left over for therapy or pleasure riding. Surely the demand can't be that high.
Well, we're only getting numbers from our authorities to say that they're not in the vast amounts, but in fact in New South Wales they're saying zero. So we can't stop there. We can't just rely on numbers. We've got to make sure that it's not happening. So yes, there's a lot of horses. Fortunately, there's a lot of people that love horses around Australia, not just in racing, but obviously sporting horses, pleasure horses, and just people that are happy to see horses retiring in their paddocks. Obviously, they're a big animal. They take a lot to look after, but they're like any animal. They're a pet to us. My staff are animal lovers. They're not just horse lovers, and that's the same as the majority of all participants in the industry, and it's the third biggest employer of people in Australia. So the racing's not going anywhere, but we've got to make sure that these stories don't appear and that these stories are finished.
Chris, I can see you're very devastated by the footage that's been aired. But for those of us who really don't understand what happens to these horses, what their lives are like, we know that these horses are bred for racing. We know that they're trained and they're used to vigorous exercises. We know that they're highly strung because of how they've been bred. They need riders who know how to give them a good workout. How then do they make that transition to become docile therapy horses or riding horses for children?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and probably not perfect for children, but a horse will change. When they're in our racing stables, they're fed a high-grain diet. When they come out of training, they go back onto pasture, grass and hay, for example, and they lose that heat and that explosive power quite quickly. We're seeing a lot of great stories in racing as well. A lot of horses getting rehomed, for instance, to the prisons, to the riding for the disabled. So we've got young kids riding these horses, but they've got to be in the right hands. So it's our job as the leaders of the industry to make sure that they are ending up in the right hands. They are being properly looked after, and because of the number of them, it's a big job. And the money's there. We can afford to do it. Obviously, the upkeep of a horse is a lot, but we've got to factor that into our future budgets.
Just explain to us again, for those of us who don't really know what happens to a horse when it retires. When is the decision made to retire a horse, and what is the normal procedure after that?
Well, a young horse enters my stable, it's carefully looked after. We've got a vet at the stable every day making sure we're not overtraining horses, not putting pressure on horses so that there's no stress. When they become to a mature racing age, which is about 2 years old, so they've already been in the stable for at least a year and well looked after from day one, and there's regulatory bodies that are over all of this. From the day of a birth, the horse has to be registered. It has a passport that goes with it wherever it travels. So all the way through to racing, and then I guess the terms of that horse's ability will determine how long it races for. Horses will change from around Australia. Sydney, Melbourne, you're seeing the spring carnivals at the moment. That's where the best horses are at the moment. Unfortunately, not all the horses are the best, so that's when they move out to the country areas where they have great horsemen that have been brought up with horses throughout their lives. There's no mistreatment of stables. If I have one of my members strike a horse, they're removed from employment. We find them other jobs because they're just not capable of working with the horses. So I guess getting back to your question, where do they go? Well, Racing New South Wales have purchased a couple of farms, massive farms that horses can go to if we can't find homes for them, but it's our job to find those homes. So I'm proud to say that we find homes for all of our horses, or find what we think are suitable placements. But there was a horse brought up in that story that had been from my stable, but it was 2 years afterwards. It had raced in another trainer's care for 2 years, and I understand that he then found a suitable home, but it found its place at an abattoir, which I'm shocked about. And I'm not going to hide it because it needs to be dealt with.
As you mentioned, there is a breakdown in the system. You mentioned too about the Spring Carnival. Of course, we've got the Caulfield Cup and the Everest race today. Going forward, do you think this revelation will affect attendance at major horse racing events?
I don't think so, but we've got to make sure that the community can see that this sport is vibrant and it is a sport that we're staying on top of. We are looking after the horses, we are moving with the times, and I think that's obvious to see what's happened in the last few years. There is a lot of improvements to rules, regulations, and how a horse is kept, how it's looked after, how it's raced. The veterinary care has just gone to a whole new level. The regulatory bodies are on the front foot. They've done a lot. They've got a welfare plan in place, but we've got to make sure that it just follows beyond racing into their last days.
Chris, it's so good getting your insight. Thank you so much. Just champion horse trainer there, Chris Waller.